He walked in alone. No medals, no ribbons. Just the heavy silence of a man who had carried too much and said too little. Around him, the whispers grew louder. Some snickered behind coffee cups. Others leaned in close to trade rumors like secrets. They called him the veteran with nothing to show. But he didn't flinch. His eyes, steady and unbroken, told another story. The air was thick with unspoken judgment, until the door opened and a Navy SEAL in dress blues stepped through. The room fell still as the SEAL's boots crossed the polished floor. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just looked at the veteran, and then slowly, with every eye watching, dropped to one knee in a salute that cut through every lie and every doubt. In that single gesture, the laughter turned to reverent silence. The weight of the moment pressed on every chest like a confession. Because some medals aren't pinned to a uniform. Some legends don't need ribbons to prove they're real. And some men, like this quiet veteran, carry a code name that no one dares to forget. If that moment has already set your heart pounding, don't stop now. Stay with us because the story only grows deeper. Subscribe to Endless Stories and let the echoes of this man's silent strength carry you into the heart of what respect truly means. He walked into the grand hall like a shadow, silent and unassuming. His steps were measured, careful, as though every footfall was a promise he had made long ago and refused to break. He wore no medals on his chest, no brass pins or embroidered ribbons to tell the world of the weight he had carried across decades. His jacket was old but clean, pressed by hands that still remembered the discipline of a man who once knew what it meant to stand in line, to hold his breath and wait for the command to move. Around him, the room sparkled. Chandeliers dripped with crystals that caught the light like captured stars. Silverware gleamed on tables set with precision. Napkins folded into sharp angles that spoke of order, of wealth, of a world where everything was neat and nothing was out of place. But he didn't belong to that world, not really. Not in the way they understood. He moved among them like a ghost passing through the living, his eyes catching every detail. The flicker of judgment in a mother's glance, the tight smiles of men who measured worth by the weight of a ring on their finger or the cut of their suit. The veteran saw it all, and he said nothing. Silence had been his companion for so long that it was almost a comfort now. At the entrance, 2 guards in matching suits shifted as he approached. They wore their authority like armor, their posture rigid, their eyes sharp. One was older, his face creased with the lines of a man who had seen too much paperwork and too few battles. The other was young, his jaw set in the way of someone still learning how to carry power. "Sir," the older guard said, his voice even but his eyes cold. "This area is for guests of the graduates. May I see your invitation?" The veteran reached into his pocket, his fingers slow, deliberate. He pulled out a folded program, the paper worn soft at the edges. He held it out, and the younger guard took it, his eyes flicking over the name and then back up, his lips curling just slightly. "This doesn't look official," he said, handing it back with a flick of his wrist. "We can't let you in without proper clearance." The veteran took the paper back, folding it once more along the same lines it had always held. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he looked past them, into the hall where rows of chairs waited, the stage set with banners of blue and white. His son would walk across that stage today. His son would stand tall, and the veteran would be there to see it. That was all that mattered. "I'm here for my son," he said quietly, the words simple, without weight. But the young guard shifted, uncomfortable beneath that calm. "Sir, I understand," he said, though he didn't understand at all. "But rules are rules. You'll have to wait outside." The veteran stood his ground. He wasn't a man who had spent his life asking for permission. He had fought in places these young men couldn't imagine, in jungles that swallowed the light and in deserts where the sun was a blade. He had carried men on his back and buried friends in soil that wasn't their own. He had worn a uniform once, too, and the weight of it had never left his shoulders. But he didn't say any of that. He only said, "I have nothing to prove." His voice was steady, each word a stone laid carefully in the space between them. "I will see my son walk today." The older guard's mouth tightened. "I'm sorry, sir, but without the proper pass, "You're not authorized." His hand hovered near the veteran's arm, a gesture that was almost kind, almost apologetic. But it was still a hand that meant to move him, to push him away from where he stood. The veteran didn't flinch. He didn't move at all. Around them, the whispers grew. A woman in a blue dress leaned closer to her husband, her eyes flicking from the veteran to the guards and back again. A teenager in a pressed shirt shifted from foot to foot, caught between the weight of ceremony and the quiet tension building like a storm. The younger guard took a breath. "Sir, you need to leave." The words were soft but final. He reached for the veteran's elbow, fingers curling around the worn fabric of the jacket. It was meant to be a gentle pressure, a suggestion more than a command. But to the veteran it was a line drawn in the sand. For a moment he let the hand stay there, feeling the weight of it. Then, slowly, he looked down at those fingers, then back up into the guard's eyes. "Son," he said, the word as heavy as a lifetime, "don't put your hands on me." The quiet in his voice was the quiet of men who have stood in the dark and waited for the world to end. It was the quiet of a man who knew that dignity could not be taken. It could only be surrendered, and he had no intention of surrendering anything today. The guard's face flushed. He let go, stepping back, his shoulders tense. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the older guard cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Let's not make a scene," he said, though it was already too late. The scene was there, hanging in the air like the echo of a shot. The veteran looked at them both, his eyes steady. "I'm not the one making it," he said. He folded the program once more, slipping it back into his pocket, and took a single step forward. They didn't stop him. They didn't try to touch him again. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath. Because in that moment, no medals, no ribbons, no polished shoes, he wasn't a man to be moved. He was a man to be respected. And respect, he knew, wasn't something you could demand. It was something you earned in the quiet spaces between words. Something that no ceremony could give and no uniform could take away. He walked past them without another word, his steps sure, his head high. Behind him, the two guards watched him go, their eyes wide, their hands dropping to their sides. Around them, the whispers grew louder, but the veteran didn't hear them. He had learned long ago how to move through a world that didn't want to see him, how to claim space with nothing more than the way he stood. He found an empty seat near the back, the worn fabric of the chair welcoming him like an old friend. He sat, folding his hands in his lap, and waited. His son would walk across that stage today. And when he did, the veteran would be there to see it. That was all that mattered. And though no medals gleamed on his chest, though no one called his name with reverence or applause, he sat there like a monument to every silent battle he had ever fought. Because in the end, he didn't need a ribbon to prove he had earned his place in that room. He didn't need permission to stand where he stood. He had already won the only war that ever mattered, the one inside. He sat there as the minutes stretched on, each second a heartbeat in the hush of the hall. Around him, parents checked their watches and shifted in their seats, conversations in low murmurs about scholarships, future plans, and the best schools for bright children. He didn't join them. He watched the stage, the way the banners swayed in the soft current of the air conditioning. He imagined his son's name echoing in the hall, the applause that would follow, and he let the weight of that future fill his chest. The veteran's hands rested in his lap, fingers thick and calloused from years of work that had nothing to do with marble floors or polite nods. His nails were clean, but the scars that mapped his knuckles told stories no one in that room would ever ask him to tell. He sat with a posture that was both at ease and unmovable, his back straight, his chin lifted, as though he was back in formation even if no one else knew it. He was used to waiting. He had waited for orders in foreign fields, for news that never came, for friends who never returned. Waiting was as natural as breathing. A young couple sat 2 rows ahead, the woman glancing back at him now and then with a kind of wary curiosity. The man beside her leaned in to whisper. His words meant only for her, but the veteran heard them anyway. "He doesn't look like he belongs here," the young man said, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. The woman said nothing, only looked away quickly, her shoulders stiff. The veteran didn't react. He had learned long ago that belonging had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with the ground you claimed for yourself. At the edge of the hall, the two guards who had tried to turn him away now stood with arms crossed, their eyes flicking to him every few minutes as if they were waiting for him to vanish. They didn't approach again. The quiet challenge in his eyes had been enough. But still they watched, because men like them were taught to see threats in the silences of men like him. He knew it. He had lived it. Then the doors at the back of the hall swung open with a hush of heavy air, and a young man in full dress blues stepped inside. The Navy SEAL moved with the easy grace of someone who had been taught to command every room he entered. His uniform was pressed so sharp it looked like it might cut, and the trident pinned to his chest caught the light with a muted glint. He was young, his hair cropped close to the scalp, the kind of youth that still held an edge of something older, something harder, in the set of his shoulders. The room seemed to tilt as he entered, conversations trailing off, heads turning. Even the guards straightened. The SEAL didn't stop to greet anyone. His eyes swept the hall once, pausing on the stage, on the rows of guests, until they landed on the veteran sitting in the back. For a moment, their gazes locked, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, respect, a quiet echo of battles fought and burdens carried. The SEAL didn't smile. He didn't need to. He walked down the aisle with steady steps, his boots thudding softly on the plush carpet. As he passed the young couple, the man who had spoken so carelessly about the veteran found his eyes lowering, words dying in his throat. The SEAL didn't glance at him. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to hush the noise. He reached the row where the veteran sat and paused, the air around him charged with something electric. He turned to face the older man, and for a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then, in a single fluid motion, the SEAL bent his knee, lowering himself until he was kneeling before the veteran. His head bowed, his hand clenched in a fist against his chest. The room gasped. It wasn't loud. A sharp breath here, a startled murmur there. But it was enough to crack the perfect surface of the hall. The young woman who had looked back at the veteran earlier pressed a hand to her mouth. The guards shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what they were seeing. Because here, in the middle of the ceremony, the balance of power had shifted without a word. "Sir," the SEAL said, his voice low but clear enough for those nearby to hear, "I know who you are. I know what you've done." His words weren't loud, but they cut through the hall like a blade. The veteran's eyes didn't waver. He looked down at the SEAL, his expression calm, as though he had expected this all along. "I was never looking for thanks," he said quietly. "I just came to see my son." The SEAL nodded, still kneeling. "I know," he said, "but there are men who should never be left to stand alone." The veteran's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath the skin. He reached out then, his hand settling on the SEAL's shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude that didn't need words. Around them, the room held its breath. Every eye was on them, every conversation stilled, as though the entire world had narrowed to this single moment of silent honor. The guards who had once tried to push him out now looked away, their faces pale, their shoulders slumping. The young man who had mocked him shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone, replaced by something like shame, because in that kneeling figure, they saw the truth they had refused to see. This was no man to be dismissed. This was a man who had earned his place not with medals but with every breath he had taken in service of something greater than himself. The SEAL stood slowly, the movement precise and respectful. He didn't salute in the way of parades and ceremonies. Instead, he gave a small nod, his eyes meeting the veterans with the weight of everything that had passed between them in that silent exchange. Then he turned and took his place at the edge of the hall, his posture still and watchful, as though he had appointed himself the guardian of this moment. The veteran let out a slow breath, his hand dropping back to his lap. Around him, the room began to move again. Conversations resumed, the music swelled, but the air was different now. There was no more laughter at his expense, no more sidelong glances or whispered judgments. In the quiet power of that kneeling gesture, The room had been reminded that some honors don't need medals to shine. He sat a little straighter in his chair, his shoulders squared. He was still the man he had always been. No medals, no ribbons, just a name and a history that no one could take away. And when his son finally walked across that stage, he would be there, watching, silent, but never unseen. The silence that followed that moment seemed to echo in the veteran's ears long after the seal had stood and taken his place at the edge of the room. It was a silence he had known before, the kind that settled on a battlefield after the last shot had been fired. A silence that wasn't empty but thick with all the things left unsaid, the weight of lives saved and lost, the gravity of what it means to truly belong. The veteran let it wash over him. A steady calm in a world that so often tried to drown him in noise. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the steady rhythm of his own breathing, each breath a testament to everything he had carried and everything he still carried. In the quiet of his thoughts, he remembered faces. Men who had stood beside him in places the world would never see. Men who had laughed with him in the mud and cried with him in the dark. Men who had worn no medals but had hearts forged in fire and loyalty. The world outside these walls might never understand what it meant to be one of them, but the seal had. In that kneel, he had spoken a language of brotherhood that no words could capture. The veteran's thoughts were interrupted by a voice, soft but uncertain. "Sir?"
"Maivisit here?"
He looked up to see the young woman from earlier, the one whose husband had spoken so carelessly. She stood beside him now, her hands twisting the program in her fingers, her expression apologetic. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. She sat, her shoulders tense, her eyes flicking to his face and then away again. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it. "For what he said. For how we looked at you." The veteran said nothing for a moment, letting her words settle between them. Then he turned his head, his eyes kind but unwavering. "You don't owe me an apology," he said gently. "But you owe it to yourself to remember. A man's worth isn't in the medals he wears. It's in the way he stands when no one else will stand with him." She swallowed, nodding, her cheeks flushing pink. "Thank you," she whispered. The ceremony began then, the room shifting as the first name was called and a young man in cap and gown walked across the stage, his family erupting in cheers. One by one, names echoed in the hall, a steady procession of youth and promise. The veteran watched them all, his eyes never leaving the stage. Each name was a prayer, each step a promise. When his son's name was finally called, he leaned forward, hands tightening on his knees. His son walked with the same quiet confidence the veteran had carried all his life, head high, eyes clear. He wore no medals either, but he carried the weight of his father's legacy in every step. Their eyes met, and in that moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The son smiled, small but sure, and the veteran felt something in his chest loosen. A knot he hadn't known he was holding unwinding in the warmth of that smile. The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that washed over him, but the veteran heard only the quiet echo of his own heartbeat. He clapped with the others, his hands steady, his pride a quiet flame in his chest. His son had done what he had come here to see. That was enough. As the last names were called and the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd began to shift again, people standing, stretching, gathering their things. The young woman beside him turned to him once more. "You must be so proud," she said softly. The veteran nodded, his lips curving in a smile that reached his eyes. "I am," he said, "more than I can say." The guards at the back of the hall had stopped watching him now. Their eyes were elsewhere, their shoulders slumping with the weight of a duty they had almost failed to understand. The seal, too, had stepped back into the flow of the crowd, his posture relaxed but his eyes still sharp. He caught the veteran's gaze across the room and gave a small nod, a silent promise that he would remember what others had tried to forget. The veteran stood then, his knees creaking in protest but his back straight. He moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, each step deliberate, each breath steady. People parted for him now without even realizing it, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't deny. He reached the lobby just as the graduates began to file out, their laughter and shouts filling the air with a new kind of music. His son found him there, stepping out of the crowd in his cap and gown, his eyes bright with pride and relief. "Dad," he said, his voice catching on the word. The veteran smiled, laying a hand on his son's shoulder. "You did good," he said simply. No long speeches, no grand declarations. Just those 3 words, and the weight of everything behind them. They stood there for a moment, father and son, the noise of the world washing around them like water around a rock. Then the SEAL stepped forward, his uniform still immaculate, his eyes warm. "Sir," he said to the veteran, and then to the son, "you've got a good man to guide you." The son nodded, his own shoulders squaring as he met the SEAL's gaze. "I know," he said. "I've always known." The SEAL extended his hand to the veteran, and when the older man took it, the grip was firm, the kind of handshake that said more than any medal ever could. "It was an honor," the SEAL said quietly. "To kneel, to let them see." The veteran nodded once, his eyes clear. "The honor was mine," he said, and in that moment, surrounded by the chatter and laughter of a world that was finally starting to see, there was nothing more to be said. They turned then, father and son, and walked out of the hall together. The crowd moved around them, a river of motion, but they moved like they were carved from stone, unshakable, unbreakable. And though the veteran wore no medals, though his chest was bare, he walked with the quiet certainty of a man who had earned every step of the journey that had brought him to this moment. He walked with his son through the tall glass doors of the building, the air outside cooler now that the sun had begun to dip below the city's skyline. The veteran's steps were measured, his gait steady despite the long day, and his son walked close at his side, cap in hand, eyes bright with pride and relief. They didn't speak for a moment, content to let the silence fill the spaces where words would have felt too small. There was something almost sacred in the quiet that stretched between them, something that said more than any sentence ever could. Around them, families poured out of the building, laughter and chatter filling the air, cameras flashing, mothers fussing with hair and ties. The veteran watched it all with a calm detachment, his eyes taking in every detail, the way a soldier scans a horizon for things others might miss. He had learned long ago that it was the small things that mattered most. A father's hand on a son's shoulder, a mother's tearful smile, the glint of a medal that meant something only to the man who had earned it. His son looked at him, his lips parting as though to speak, then closing again. The veteran reached out, laying a hand on his shoulder. A simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of a lifetime of lessons. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "I know." The young man nodded, his shoulders straightening as though the weight of those words had settled into him like steel. "I wanted you to see me," he said finally, his voice soft but sure. "I wanted you to be here." The veteran's lips curved in a small, proud smile. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything," he said. They walked a little further, away from the crowd, until they found a quiet spot near the edge of the courtyard, a low wall where they could sit and watch the last light of day slip across the city's face. The veteran eased himself down onto the stone, his joints protesting but his posture still straight. His son sat beside him, cap resting on his knee, and for a moment they just sat in silence, watching the world move around them. It was then that the SEAL approached again, his uniform still sharp, his boots polished to a mirror's shine. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to protect, his eyes scanning the crowd even as he zeroed in on the veteran. When he reached them, he paused, his hand resting lightly on the back of the bench, his head bowing slightly in respect. "Sir," he said, his voice low but clear, "I hope I didn't overstep earlier." The veteran looked up at him, his eyes steady. "You didn't," he said simply. "You reminded them who we are." The SEAL nodded, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "That was my intention," he said. The young man beside the veteran looked up at the SEAL, his eyes wide with a kind of awe. "You knew him?" he asked softly. The SEAL's gaze shifted to the boy, his expression softening. "I knew of him," he said. "Men like your father." Their stories are the reason we're able to stand here today. The young man swallowed, his throat working as he absorbed the weight of those words. The veteran reached out, his hand resting lightly on his son's knee. "It's not about medals," he said quietly. "It's about the men who stood beside you when the world went dark. Remember that." His son nodded, his eyes shining. "I will," he said. For a moment, the three of them stood there in a silence that was anything but empty. It was the kind of silence that spoke of things too big for words. Sacrifice, loyalty, the unspoken bond between those who had given everything for something bigger than themselves. Around them, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade, the bright lights and laughter turning into a distant hum. In that quiet, there was a kind of reverence that no ceremony could ever match. The seal straightened then, his posture shifting back into the crisp lines of duty. "I should go," he said, his voice soft but certain. "But if you ever need anything, sir, my name is known to you." The veteran nodded, his hand lifting in a gesture of silent understanding. "And yours is known to me," he said. The seal gave a final nod, then turned and disappeared back into the flow of people, his steps steady and sure. The veteran watched him go, his eyes thoughtful. He felt the weight of the moment settle around his shoulders like a cloak, heavy but familiar. His son shifted beside him, his fingers tracing the edge of his cap, and then he looked up at his father, his eyes full of questions he hadn't yet learned how to ask. "Was it really like that?" he asked softly. "The way he knelt, the way he looked at you?" The veteran turned to him, his gaze calm and steady. "It was," he said, "and it was everything." They sat there a little longer, watching as the sky turned from gold to deep blue, the city lights blinking on one by one like distant stars. Around them, the world moved on, cars passing, voices rising and falling, the endless rhythm of life. But in that small space, in the quiet that wrapped around them like an old friend, there was a peace the veteran hadn't known in a long time. It was the peace of knowing he had been seen, truly seen, by someone who understood what it meant to stand alone in a room full of people who would never understand. When the sun finally slipped below the horizon, the veteran rose, his movements slow but deliberate. His son stood with him, his cap clutched in his hands, his shoulders straight and his eyes clear. "Let's go home," the veteran said, his voice soft but certain. And together, they walked away from the bright lights and the noise, two men bound by blood and by something deeper, something that didn't need medals to shine. As they disappeared into the quiet streets, the veteran felt a calm settle into his bones. He had come for one reason, to see his son walk across that stage. He had done that, and along the way he had been reminded that some honors are too big for ribbons, some legacies too deep for brass and silk. In the end, it wasn't the medals that mattered. It was the man, and in that he had everything he needed. The next morning broke clear and quiet, the city's early light painting the rooftops in gentle gold. The veteran woke with the dawn, his body used to the rhythm of rising before the world. He dressed slowly, each motion deliberate, the familiar motions of a man who had learned long ago that even the smallest things deserved his full attention. The jacket he chose was simple, the fabric worn smooth at the elbows, a testament to years of honest work and quiet pride. He paused to smooth the lapel with a careful hand, then let it fall, satisfied with what he saw. His son was already awake, standing at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands. He turned when he heard his father's footsteps, a soft smile touching his lips. "Morning," he said. The veteran nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly in return. "Morning," he replied, his voice low and steady. They didn't speak for a while, the silence between them companionable. Outside, the city moved on, traffic humming in the distance, the world already rushing forward. But in that small kitchen, time seemed to slow, the air thick with things that didn't need to be said. Finally, his son set the cup down, his fingers drumming lightly on the worn wood of the table. "Are you going to the ceremony today?" he asked quietly. The veteran tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly in question. "Another ceremony?" he asked. His son nodded. "They're giving out medals today," he said, "for the graduates who served, for their families." He hesitated, then added, "They want you to come. They want to give you something too." The veteran was silent for a moment, his gaze steady. "I've never needed medals to know what I've done," he said finally. His son's shoulders straightened. "I know," he said, "but maybe it's not just about you. Maybe it's about everyone who came after." The veteran didn't reply, but something in his eyes softened. He reached out, resting his hand on his son's shoulder, a silent agreement that said more than any promise. "Let's go see what they have to say," he said, his voice low but resolute. Together, they left the apartment, stepping out into the clean morning air. The city was just beginning to wake, the sidewalks still quiet, the lights soft and full of promise. They walked side by side, their steps in sync, the quiet strength of men who didn't need to announce themselves to the world. The hall was already filling when they arrived, families and friends gathering in small clusters, the air alive with the low murmur of conversation. Banners hung from the high ceilings, the colors bright and bold, and at the front of the room, a long table held rows of shining medals and ribbons, each one a symbol of honor, of sacrifice, of stories most would never hear. The veteran paused at the threshold, his eyes moving slowly across the room. He saw the medals, the way they caught the light, and he felt the weight of their meaning settle on his shoulders. But he didn't let it bend him. He had carried heavier things in his life. They moved through the crowd quietly, people parting around them, some glancing up in recognition, others simply drawn by the calm gravity of the veteran's presence. Near the front of the room, the SEAL stood, his posture straight, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd. When he saw the veteran, his expression shifted, a flicker of something like relief passing across his face. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched, and when the veteran took it, their grip was firm, the silence between them thick with unspoken understanding. "Sir," the SEAL said quietly, his voice low but clear, "I'm glad you came." The veteran inclined his head, his expression calm. "You asked," he said simply. The SEAL smiled, a small curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes but didn't need to. "I did," he said, "and I meant it." He turned then, gesturing to the stage where a line of dignitaries waited, their faces polite, their hands folded in practiced stillness. "They want to recognize the families today," he said, "the ones who stood behind us when we stood in the dark." The veteran's lips pressed together, his eyes thoughtful. "Then let them," he said quietly. They took their seats near the front, the SEAL moving to stand beside the podium, his presence a quiet promise that the ceremony would be more than just words. The room settled, the soft rustle of programs and shifting feet fading into a respectful hush. A woman in a dark suit stepped forward, her hands resting lightly on the podium as she began to speak. She talked of duty, of sacrifice, of the quiet strength of those who never asked for recognition but who had earned it all the same. Her words were smooth, practiced, but there was something genuine in her voice, a flicker of understanding that reached past the polish of her speech. When she finished, the medals were brought forward, each one cradled in a velvet-lined box, each one a gleaming testament to something bigger than any one man. Names were called, applause rising and falling in waves, and one by one, families stepped forward to accept the small weight of medal and ribbon that somehow meant so much. The veteran watched it all with a calm detachment, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his back straight. He didn't need the weight of a medal to know the weight he had carried. When his name was finally called, the room seemed to grow still, the silence deepening in a way that felt almost reverent. He stood slowly, his movements measured, each step a deliberate echo of every step he had taken in the years that had brought him here. As he reached the stage, the SEAL stepped forward, the medal in his hands catching the light. But he didn't offer it right away. He looked at the veteran, his eyes steady, and then he knelt, his head bowing in a gesture that was more than respect. It was acknowledgement, a tribute from one warrior to another. The room held its breath. The veteran stood there, the quiet strength of a man who had never needed medals to know his own worth. Slowly, he reached down, his hand closing around the seal's shoulder, a silent acceptance of the honor that was being offered. When the seal rose, he placed the medal in the veteran's hands, his own fingers brushing the rough skin of the older man's palm. "This is yours," he said quietly. "Not because of what you wore, but because of who you are." The veteran nodded, his lips pressing into a line that was almost a smile. He turned to the room then, the medal in his hand, and in that simple gesture, he reminded them all that some men don't need to speak to be heard. The morning after the ceremony dawned crisp and clear, the sky a pale blue that spoke of fresh beginnings and quiet reckonings. The veteran woke before the sun, as he always had, his body tuned to a rhythm that didn't care for alarms or the comfort of warm sheets. He rose slowly, the stiffness in his joints a familiar ache, and dressed in the same simple way he always did, each movement deliberate, each fold and button a small act of discipline that reminded him who he was and who he had always been. His son stirred in the next room, the soft rustle of sheets and the low murmur of half-formed dreams spilling into the dawn. The veteran paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, watching the young man sleep. There was a peace in his son's face, a calm he hadn't seen there in a long time, and it eased something in the veteran's chest. He turned away then, moving quietly down the hall, the worn medal he had been given yesterday resting on the small table by the door, catching the first light of the day. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, the weight of it solid and cool against his skin. It wasn't the medal itself that mattered. It was what it represented, the unspoken truth that had been too long ignored. The veteran closed his hand around it, feeling the edges bite lightly into his palm, and then set it back down, the decision quiet but sure. Some honors were meant to be carried inside, not worn for others to see. He stepped outside into the early morning air, the city still half asleep around him, the hush of dawn a gentle balm to the restless echoes of yesterday. He walked with slow purpose, each step steady, the rhythm of his footsteps a quiet testament to every mile he had traveled, every burden he had borne. The streets were empty, the usual noise of the day still waiting to rise, and in that soft, empty space, he found a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. He walked without destination, his path winding through the quiet streets and alleys that had always been more honest to him than any grand hall. He paused now and then to watch the light shift across the windows, the sun climbing slow and sure, painting the world in a glow that spoke of second chances and unspoken truths. At a small cafe on the corner, he stopped, the rich scent of fresh coffee and warm bread spilling out into the street. He stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly, and took a seat at the counter, his hands resting on the worn wood, his posture easy but watchful. The woman behind the counter greeted him with a smile, her eyes kind, her movements practiced and sure. "Morning," she said, her voice warm in the quiet. "Coffee?" He nodded, his lips curving in a faint smile. "Black," he said simply. She poured it for him, the dark liquid steaming in the cup, and set it in front of him with a small plate of toast. "On the house," she said with a wink. "You look like you've earned it." The veteran chuckled softly, the sound low and quiet, and nodded his thanks. He took a slow sip, the bitter warmth of it settling in his chest, grounding him in the simple truth of the moment. As he drank, he watched the world wake up around him. The quiet murmur of conversation, the soft clatter of plates and silverware, the rustle of newspapers and the low hum of a city remembering itself. And in that small, bustling cafe, he found a kind of belonging that no ceremony could offer, the kind that didn't need medals or applause, just the shared space of honest lives, lived without pretense. A young man stepped into the cafe then, his posture straight, his eyes clear and watchful. The seal. He moved with the same quiet authority, his presence a calm ripple in the easy flow of the morning. He caught sight of the veteran and paused, his lips curving in a smile that was both greeting and acknowledgement. He walked over, pulling out the stool beside the older man, and sat without ceremony. "Sir," he said, his voice low and respectful. The veteran nodded, his expression calm. "Morning," he said. The seal glanced at the medal resting in the veteran's pocket, the edge of it just visible in the light. "You're not wearing it," he observed quietly. The veteran took another sip of his coffee, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Some things," he said, "don't need to be worn to be real." The seal nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said. They sat in silence then, the kind of quiet that was as comfortable as an old coat, filled with the weight of things that didn't need to be said. Around them, the cafe moved on, the easy rhythm of life unbroken. But in that small space at the counter, there was a stillness that felt almost sacred. After a long moment, the seal turned to him, his eyes steady. "They'll be talking about you for a long time," he said. The veteran didn't look up from his coffee. "Let them," he said softly. "What matters is that my son knows who I am. That's enough." The seal smiled then, a small curve of his lips that spoke of respect and understanding. "He does," he said, "more than anyone else ever could." The veteran nodded, the quiet pride in his eyes as deep and steady as the city that moved around them. "That's all I need," he said. They sat there for a while longer, the morning light shifting across the worn wood of the counter, the world outside the window bright and new. When the seal finally rose to leave, he paused, his hand resting lightly on the veteran's shoulder. "Take care, sir," he said quietly. The veteran looked up, his eyes clear and steady. "You too," he said. The seal walked out into the bright morning, his steps sure, his posture easy. The veteran watched him go, the faintest smile on his lips, and then turned back to his coffee, the warmth of it grounding him in the quiet truth of who he was and who he had always been. He stayed there until the cup was empty, the last of the coffee cold at the bottom, and then he rose, leaving a few bills on the counter, his movements slow but certain. He stepped out into the sun, the city waking around him in a chorus of sound and motion, and he walked home with the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. Because in the end, it wasn't the medals or the titles that mattered. It was the way he had stood when the world tried to move him, the way he had kept his silence when others tried to fill it with noise, the way he had claimed his place not with brass and ribbons, but with the quiet dignity of a man who knew exactly who he was. And in that, he had found all the honor he would ever need. Thank you for staying with us through every quiet step, every silent promise, and every moment of truth that can't be pinned to a ribbon. If the story moved you, if you felt the quiet power of one man's stand for dignity, don't let it end here. Share it, let someone else feel it too, and subscribe to Endless Stories, where every whisper matters and every quiet act of courage is honored. Because sometimes, the best stories are the ones that never shout but leave an echo in your heart.